Welcome, everyone, to the Mindful Moments podcast, a space for us to explore what mindfulness practices and what living more mindfully can look like in different people's lives, both inside and outside of the classroom. My name's Lily. I am the founder of Mindful Sparks, and today I'm joined by Rose Whitney, a career coach and supply teacher. So Rose has been in education for almost 10 years, working at both schools at home in the UK and international schools in Bangkok, Thailand, before moving into youth work. She's a big fan of dogs and is still terrible at writing introductions for herself. So, as some of you may know, Rose is on the advisory board for Mindful Sparks and has greatly impacted how Mindful Sparks has grown. And she's back for another chat. So, if you haven't listened to our previous conversation, I really recommend that you go do that before you continue with the conversations here, as it will give you some context as to what we're going to be talking about. So, I'm super excited to have you back and chat with you again. And I guess one thing, the big question is, like, after our last conversation, what did you notice? Like, why do you want to come back and chat some more?
Yeah, in the couple of days after we spoke last time, I had all these ideas and was reflecting on mindfulness in a in the context of sort of like the general public and some of the barriers, especially in the context of some of the families that I work with. Um, I work in one of the poorest counties in the UK, and I think some of those people that I work with would benefit from mindfulness the most, but they also face so many barriers to accessing it. So I was thinking about how we could investigate those barriers and kind of make that access, that aperture wider to be able to allow people who, they're facing all these challenges. And I think most people are struggling these days. And I think that, the world that we've created kind of it needs mindfulness as a remedy. And yeah, I just wanted to talk some more about some of the barriers and some of the stuff that we've spoken about over the years, and things that from my own practice I've kind of gleaned and just wanted to share a bit more. So thank you for having me back.
Awesome. I think it's such an important point that you raise about barriers, because a lot of people, even when you just approach, like, people will say, oh, what do you do for work? Oh, I have a business and we take mindfulness into schools, we train teachers, we do student workshops. Oh gosh, I couldn't do that. It's so difficult. Like, there's such an immediate wall that goes up with so many people. I can't sit still and be quiet. Oh, I don't want to do meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And where those barriers come from, like, sometimes there's opportunities to talk, like, why do you feel it's meditation? Like, what's giving you that impression that you have to be still and quiet? And these are, when you're looking at the wide spectrum of barriers, these are preconceived notions, like they're misinformation a lot of the time.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of the time you can work through those barriers. You can find a way to engage somebody, or to connect with somebody. So I think it's also really important to talk about the other end of the spectrum, where there are real barriers. And it's not just so much barriers to access mindfulness, but barriers to access life, to live a
Yeah.
healthy life where you can access healthcare and education and food and housing. And,
Yeah.
that's such a big question. Like, where do you start with all of that?
Mm. And understanding the kind of cyclical nature of struggle,
Mm.
in that, a lot of the struggle that, like the families that I work with, they don't have um they don't have the control over their situation. A lot of it is out of their control. But of the part that they can control, which is narrow, it is narrow, how do we kind of work with that to be able to break some of that stress, the really difficult mental health state of a lot of people. um and I think, we spoke last time about discipline a lot, I think, didn't we? And how for some people, like, that just works, and they sort of fall into that kind of, quite routine, structured, that works for them, and that's super cool. But I think if we're looking at it on a bigger scale, and also mindfulness as a tool to bring about social change, to alleviate some of the symptoms of a difficult time to be alive, really. And I'm sure every, era and epoch has had its can be classed as a difficult time to be alive, right? But I think specifically in the context of mindfulness, it's hard to be mindful at the moment. And I think the things that we turn to, so the alternative, which is something that I think a lot of us are stuck in, and I know you and I have spoken about how we both really struggle with our phones, with social media. And I think the alternative to that can feed back into that cycle of struggling.
Mm.
And how do we kind of interrupt that to allow people to get a break from being in their own heads all the time and start to recover some of that control that would help improve their life experience, and in turn then their opportunities.
Mm. And I think it's also such an important conversation to be had, that responsibility doesn't just lie at that end of the spectrum, right? Because like you were saying, there are people in situations that are out of their control. They can't control their current life situation, but there are other people that can. There are people making decisions at the other end of the spectrum that is having either a direct impact or a knock-on, like a ripple effect, which again is closing that window of opportunity for so many of these people. So I think it's also important when you are thinking of it, in that regard. And this kind of concept of bottom up and top down could be put into any context. You were thinking about a school, and a school wants to bring mindfulness in. Yes, the teachers in the classrooms can be doing great work, but if you don't have the leadership, the board of governors, whoever that is, on board with it, and also implementing and understanding what the reason why people are integrating mindfulness practices into the day, it's never going to work. And even if you think about it on a familiar level, as the adult going to the child, improve your behavior, but then the adult's not modeling the behavior that they wish the child to be doing, you're constantly you're constantly setting people up for failure, because it can only go so far if there isn't that meeting in the middle, right? Would you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think teaching is so difficult at the moment. You mentioned I like moved back to England a couple of years ago, and the situation is really dire. It is so hard, and we're seeing teachers leaving the profession in droves. My uncle's been a teacher for his whole life. He's in his 60s now, and a brilliant teacher as well. He's one of the most calm, compassionate people that I know. He works in a really challenging school, and he had to take a step back from it because the demands, both from kind of like the admin side of the job, but also from responding to students' needs, which are, the year groups moving through that have been through the pandemic specifically, they need a lot of support. And they are kind of, we talked about phones and social media, and they are really, really neck deep in that world. And much as I think there's a lot of beauty to that technology, there's also so much damage that comes along with it too. There is a quote that I wanted to share actually from a philosopher called Paul Virilio. I think he was a French philosopher in the 90s. And he said, when you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. When you invent electricity, you also invent electrocution. Every technology carries its own negativity, you know. And I think when we think about like splitting the atom, you know, and we have to understand the great weight of the technology that we're putting out into the world, because, you know, social media is as addictive as gambling. There's all this regulation around gambling, you know, you have to be 18. And I noticed recently there's been a big spate of ads on TV about gambling, you know, and they have to say, oh, we've got these limits that you can put on, so gamble with us and gamble responsibly. And I think, you know, social media has come out with such a bang that we haven't really done it in a mindful way. It's not been examined enough. It's such a big, powerful, you know, money making thing too, that we haven't really been able to temper our use of it. And I'm not against social media at all. I will say I came off it for a time, and I found that I lost connection with a lot of people. And I also, you know, I remember reading a book. I can't remember which one it was. I remember reading a book and that I really enjoyed, and then at the end of it, there were recommendations of, you know, other sort of thinkers and authors to follow, and they were on social media. It was, you know, this person posts really great content about, I feel like it was about body image, that sort of stuff. And they were all on Instagram. So I did get back on Instagram, but I'm so strict about, I use it to learn stuff, or I use it to connect with people that I wouldn't be able to connect with otherwise. And I use it to look at funny videos of dogs because that's another great use of it as well, you know. And we do need that. It's a great distraction tool. And sometimes when things are really overwhelming, distraction is a good, you know, response. But it's when it becomes out of kilter, you know, there's excess. You've got people spending their every spare moment on it. And that's not to say anything negative about those people. And I think that's one of the problems, is that, you know, there's a bit of a snobbery about people who spend a lot of time on their phones and social media and stuff, and, oh, get out into nature, you know, that kind of thing. When actually what we know is these platforms, as much as they are spaces where a lot of good does happen, you know, they are exploiting neural vulnerabilities that human brains have. You know, it's an addictive thing. And that goes down to a chemical level of the brain. It's not a weakness of character. It's not something to hold against an individual person or a group of people. I think it's understanding the extent to which those things are programmed to be black holes that consume an endless amount of attention, and that, you know, their gravitational pull is so strong. And if you're struggling in life already, and this is what I see with, you know, a lot of the people that I work with, like, life is so hard already. They need something easy. They need a break. They need a respite. They need to connect with people. And it is easier. It's easier to pick up your phone and do it. And they know that. And I think understanding some of the ways in which you're being manipulated, really, because, you know, there's a reason that influencers are earning millions of pounds a year. Our attention as a currency is so valuable because we're marketable then. And I think it's not about bashing social media as a whole. It's about, how do we use it responsibly, sorry, because it doesn't feel like there's a lot of regulation coming from the top down. Like, we're going to have to try and take control of this ourselves. And I think understanding some of the ways in which it's exploiting, like dopamine release, and also the fact that, it's an addictive thing. But whereas, if you look at other addictive things in life, like substances, certain foods, your body will only take so much of that. So if you're addicted to sugar, drugs, alcohol, your body will get to a point, during a session where it can't actually have anymore. You're going to be sick or you're going to pass out. Whereas with social media, there is no upward limit to that.
Mm.
And to me, that's a big red flag. And I think the mental health crisis that we're experiencing at the minute, like, yes, that's come from lots of different, things are influencing that. But we've kind of replaced a lot of important parts of our life with this online kind of platform, and I think that's making us suffer too. So I think it's really important to find ways to regain control over that, so that we can use it in a way that benefits us and that isn't making our health worse. It's a big ask because it's so addictive. You and I have spoken about it.
So
It's
true.
hard. Super
It
hard.
is really true. Like, it's even having all of those tools in my toolkit and having that knowledge and having that awareness. I was late the other day to a meeting because I was just wasting time on Instagram looking at things I had that didn't benefit me in any way. I was looking at rubbish, absolute rubbish, because now it's obviously set up that it just follows, it feeds your feed with things that you didn't even know you needed to know about.
Yeah,
And it's true. And you kind of think, like, even with this awareness, with this knowledge, with this understanding, I still struggle a lot. And putting things into place, I'm being really mindful now of my phone in the evening. If I'm downstairs, my phone's upstairs. Or if I'm upstairs, my phone's downstairs. So there isn't that temptation of, like, just having it near me, But even still, like, the fact that I have to do that is quite extreme, because it's not like I can have my phone next to me without being distracted by it. But that takes a conscious decision to make. And that conscious decision has come from reflecting and acknowledging, holding myself accountable, saying, yeah, this behavior isn't benefiting me. This behavior doesn't support my mental well-being, or this behavior isn't in line with the values of what I'm trying, the life I'm trying to create, to live. Because I have that luxury and I have that privilege, and I acknowledge that I have that privilege because I can pay my rent. I know where my next meal is coming from, and I can sit down and reflect on that. And another thing that I really wanted to pick up on, that quote, I've forgotten the person's name, but you were saying about, like, when we invent the ship, we invent the shipwreck. It's the first time I've heard it, and it really kind of, like, resonated with me of like, what is it, for every, I'm going to get this terribly wrong, and for people that I'm going to offend, I apologize, but what is it, for every action there's a equal reaction or something like that, for every
equal and opposite reaction.
Equal and opposite reaction. Apologies for anybody who I might have offended not knowing that exactly. But it's so true. And, like, even that made me think about, I'm preparing for a training that I have coming up in a couple of weeks, and I was going over and some of the material and really thinking about, like, is this what we want to say, and is this how we want to say it? And we talk about at Mindful Sparks, we talk about our inner landscape, which is our thoughts, emotions, and responses. And then we also talk about our outer landscape, which is our words, actions, and decisions. you know, what people see and how people perceive us really is what we present. And our words, actions, and decisions are so massively influenced by our internal state. And so when you were talking about like that ship and shipwreck, it really got me thinking about like, yeah, you know what, like when I have certain thoughts or if I'm in a certain emotional state, if I'm not aware, if I'm not mindful, my habitual patterns of behavior can at times lead to the proverbial shipwreck, right? I'm saying things that I don't mean, or I'm acting in a way that isn't really, you know, how I want to react or respond. Like I'm being a bit mean, or I'm being, you know, I'm ignoring something. And yeah, that really kind of stuck with me of like, you know, every time we're putting something out there in the world, intentionally or unintentionally, again, there are those knock-on effects. It is going to have those impacts, right, on other people, whether that was our intention or not.
And I think that's so important, you know, like to hear you, the founder of this mindfulness company, and I know how hard you work. And I know you probably don't talk about it that much. So like people listening won't know how hard you work. And, you know, to hear you say, you know, I was late for this meeting because I was on Instagram. I think it really breaks the spell of thinking this is a problem with me, you know, anyone who's struggling with that sort of thing, and that's the shame element of it, which I think if there's any emotion that is a locking, it has that kind of freeze ability, it is shame. And I think a lot of us feel that, especially when it comes to mindfulness. And I think that's massively one of the barriers, because some of these online spaces, you know, we're all in this kind of online world now. So we've got to look at, people are looking. So people who maybe haven't had a mindfulness practice before or haven't heard about it before, they are experiencing it on that platform. What does it look like on there? You know, and also remembering that, especially with popular content, I think there are some great, you know, accounts on I only use Instagram, so I'm using that as my main sort of reference point. I think there are some great accounts on Instagram about mindfulness, yours being one of them. But I also think when we think about popular content, knowing what popular content, the reason it's popular, you know, we like to see things that look perfect. We like to see things that say, oh, it's simple, you know, it's easy. Just do this every day. I saw a post the other day. It was like, if you're not doing this every morning, then what are you doing? I was like, there's such a judgmental tone in some spaces, not everywhere, not everywhere. And I think that's one of the off-puts that people have about mindfulness. And you know, you're saying you speak to these people and they're like, oh, I can't sit still, I can't. And to me, that's a sign of there's an internalized something going on there. There's some negativity, shame, judgment going on there. And understanding that shame, I read a really interesting book by Rutger Bregman, who's a historian, and it was called A Hopeful History. And it was kind of looking at human beings across time, and how actually, you know, when we think, when disaster strikes, the veneer of civilization comes down and we're back to jungle law. It's kind of saying, actually, you know, if you look at it, that's not really how it looks, how it's panned out. It was looking at things like the Stanford prison experiment, which was huge and completely biased and unethical, you know. And the guy, I think it was I need to check. I think it was Philip Zimbardo who did that study, and he wanted improvement in the prisons. So he wanted his experiment to show that when we put people in a position of power over other people, they will abuse that power. So there were meetings held before the experiment where he said, look, we need to make them feel like they're nothing, we need to reduce them to nothing. And it was from good intentions, but completely, if you're looking at scientific rigor, it doesn't stand up, and yet it was kind of taken on with two hands by people. But to go back to what I was saying about shame, is he kind of looked at shame in the context of, we're the only species that blush. Shame is a social feeling, and it's a feeling of that we get when we feel like we've done something that goes against what the group expects us to do. Now, how that would have evolved over the masses of time that was spent developing this hardware would have been this, what the author was saying, when we're in those small groups, someone does something that is in their own interests over the interests of the group, so they take more than their fair share of food, or they kill somebody, they do something that is to the genuine detriment of everybody else in the group. Shame, that's where shame comes in, because they'd have been isolated then. And back then, because survival depended on us being in a group, being excluded from that group, you're pretty much guaranteed not to make it. So that's why it's such a powerful emotion. And I think understanding, should I really be feeling shame because I had donuts for my breakfast that time? No, absolutely not. I should feel shame if I go and kick a child. I would never kick a child. You should feel shame if you've done something that has genuinely made the group suffer. And it's one of those other things that it's been exploited, our susceptibility to feeling shame, and we're feeling shame about things that aren't connected to that original evolutionary purpose. So even understanding that, and this is one of the best things I have done, and actually one of the most successful, I will say, because I struggle with mindfulness. I struggle with it. I think most people, if they're being honest, unless all those thousands of variables and conditions and circumstances of life, they line up exactly perfectly and allow that to flourish. I think most people struggle with it. But one of the best and most effective things I've done is I have an eye out now for when the human tendency to feel shame is being exploited. So if I feel like I'm being sold to, and I think particularly historically for women, now much more for men as well, a lot of companies will create an idea of a deficit in order to sell you a solution to that problem. So it's like, oh, are you sick of those bumps you get on your arm, or that body hair, or that cellulite, or scrolling on your phone? Are you scrolling on your phone all the time? God, that's bad. Buy my app. And I think having a really firm stance against, and ban it away when I'm presented with that. And if I feel like my ability to feel shame about myself is being manipulated in that way, really, really strongly push against it, because turning your head away, you know, and having things like, um, I know it's more body neutrality now as well as body positivity. Like those things are great. They are so great, and they are great protective factors, and self-esteem, self-compassion, all that stuff is awesome. But there are too many elements of our daily life that are trying to exploit these vulnerabilities that we have within our brain. And it's not an individual, you know, it's not you because you've got cellulite, or you because you scroll on your phone all day. It's us, it's all of us. And that's another great antidote to shame, because it's not, it unlocks it when you spill it out into the open, because shame makes you turn in and turn away and isolate yourself and feel unworthy. Whereas when you know, if you peel it all open and look at it, I'm being manipulated, really.
And I think what's really interesting about what you say, um, you know, you have that awareness now of if there is, you know, if something is being communicated to you in a way that makes you feel less than, or that makes you feel shame, through having that awareness initially and saying, you know what, this is important to me. Like, this isn't something that I want to connect with. This isn't something that I want to engage. You know, I don't want this as part of my life. I want to be able to keep objectivity about that and appreciate, you know, see, okay, it happens, but it doesn't mean I have to get caught up in that story and narrative around it. It means that I can see it for what it is, and I can act in a way that it doesn't bring harm to me, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, one big thing, and I definitely think this has come from just having these big, deep conversations with you as well. For me, a big thing is language, and noticing when language gives me a very emotive reaction. And actually, quite recently, one of Keng's and my husband's, his aunt, she sent me an article, The Dark Side of Mindfulness, or something like that.
Mm.
It was an online article, and I read it, and because, and again, this is context, I've been practicing mindfulness for over 10 years now, and I've been meditating and breath work and journaling and yoga, and it's changed a lot over 10 years. But for the past 10 years, at least the past 10 years, I have been making conscious decisions to get to understand myself better, get to know my habits better, my habitual patterns of behavior. So this is something that I'm aware I in the past would read something and take it at face value and go, oh my gosh, this is terrible, which meant I never really had a strong opinion about many things, because I would flip-flop depending on what the most kind of common or the most popular or the most acceptable opinion was to have at that time, right? And so anyway, Stella sent me this article. It was something like The Dark Side of Mindfulness, or the something like that. And I read it, and literally within the first paragraph, like emotionally, I was so, I was really like having a strong reaction to it, because, and again, this is something I've been practicing, to notice the words that they're using and the language that's being used. And it was so many like extreme adjectives. Like, it wasn't just bad, it was awful. It wasn't like, this could do some damage. This is going to be the most disastrous thing you've ever done in your life. And so I got really curious about it, which again is such, if we're in potentially the shame state, you lose that willingness to open up and to kind of explore more, and to kind of think like, is this really true? Is this accurate? Or is this a version of a reality that I'm kind of getting caught up and lost in? So I read through it all, and I was like, God, if only I'd known this, mindfulness is terrible, I wouldn't have started this company. And so I looked at the author. I started doing some research on the author and what they do. Super interesting what they do. They work at a university in the UK. They work within a kind of neuroscience department, but they're real specialist. I went on loads of different websites, and their real specialist kind of interest is about it was about like structured spirituality and like the authenticity behind it and things like that. It was really interesting. It was a huge different conversation to have. And what I found was, because the article that she sent me was based on a different article. And so I found the original article. And for the most part, it's very similar, right? If word for word, just makes sense. But then you could begin to see the additional paragraphs that had been added in on this other article, and where they'd left out key bits from one. And it was really interesting. So these articles were 10 years apart.
Wow.
A lot of it stayed true from 10 years ago, you know, based on research, based on data. But there was one sentence that really, and I can't remember it, and I'm not going to be able to quote it, but it was like in the original one, you know, mindfulness is a practice that stems from this type of Buddhism. And it was along the lines of, even in their sutras, in their manuscripts, they say that with misleading practice, it can do more harm than good. It was along those lines. But then in the most current, up-to-date one, it said, you know, mindfulness is this Buddhist practice. All of that bit was the same, which can and will harm you.
Right.
Very, very differently from an acknowledgement of, yeah, if you do this, and if you're being misled into how to practice mindfulness, or if you have, you know, if you are challenge, you know, you have mental health challenges or anything like that, it might not be the best solution for you. But the way it was worded in the original one was like, mindfulness is going to mess you up, full stop. You know, it's bad. And for me, and so like, and then me and Stella actually had a really interesting conversation about it, because she was like, you know, I was really taken aback by this. And I was like, well, I did some research into this, and it opened up a really, really interesting conversation about that. And I just think if there was more opportunity for people to be able to do that. But again, you know, I appreciate that comes from me practicing mindfulness for a long time. So having a better understanding of what triggers me, and having a better understanding of things that I now, in this stage of my life, I'm curious about. 5 years ago, I probably would have read it and gone, whatever. Like, you know, I'm not that interested in it. But now I'm like, I want to understand why people would write that, or I want to understand where that point of view comes from. You know, and I also have time and space to be able to explore that. But language, I'm finding, is really, really interesting when it comes to, I mean, it's a huge umbrella: mindfulness, mental health, well-being. And that's something that, you know, later down the line, as Mindful Sparks evolves and grows, I'd love to be able to explore more, like the impact language has on people's willingness. I don't know if that's the right word, on people's openness to try it, you know, to try a meditation or breath work or journaling in a way that resonates with them, you know.
And there's so much there. Such an interesting anecdote, and there's so much to unpick. I would love to come back to language, if that's okay, because there's so much on that. But I think that story about that post, that article, reveals so much, and I think it also represents quite accurately what a lot of people go through in their online interactions. There was a study done in Italy, I think, that found that the more controversial a Facebook post was, the quicker it spread. And I think understanding that I saw that article too. That article popped up for me. I didn't click on it. I didn't read it. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's being shown to me. I'm not sure about Stella, what her kind of algorithm will be showing her in terms of, the content that she's engaged with. And that's how it responds to show you what you end up getting shown. I felt like it's kind of like a clickbait situation, right? And knowing that this controversial stuff, and we were talking before about attention as a currency, if you're going to get more people clicking on your article, it's going to make more money. And I think understanding that the polarization that has happened since we've moved onto this online platform, because exactly as you said, usually there isn't room for, oh, I'm going to investigate this. I'm going to look at this from a neutral standpoint, which we are not wired with that ability naturally. There was another study done in America, and it was looking at Republicans and Democrats, so two sort of sides of the political spectrum, and they presented them. They were in an MRI machine, and they presented them with facts about both candidates for the next election. And what they found was both groups of people discounted information that could not rationally be ignored. Not only that, but their brains rewarded them for it. And that's kind of confirmation bias, in essence. We do gymnastics, mental gymnastics, to make the world, the information that we get, fit the ideas that we have already. Unless that's something that happens, you practice interrupting that cycle of, oh yeah, I knew that guy was a bad guy. Oh yeah, dopamine, more content like that. Oh yeah, I knew that too. Dopamine, more content like that, and it's this big spiral. And it's built to just keep firing that stuff at you. It's built to not allow you to pause, to not allow you to read, to look into it with neutrality. And I looked at that article and had a go away. That's not helpful response, which isn't helpful, actually. What would have been great if I could have looked at it like that and gone, I wonder what this says, and to be able to research. But in that moment of time when I saw that, I was like, I can't be bothered engaging with this.
Oh my
And I
gosh.
think
Sorry.
yeah, no, it's cool, it's cool,
I
cool.
would say just really quick, me too, because that was on my every time I opened up like Google on my phone to search for something, you have like
That's where I saw it too. That's where I saw
and
it
it
too.
popping up on my phone for weeks. And I was like, I do want to read this, but like it's just not out. Like I'm actually
Yeah.
doing something on my phone. And I saw it
Yeah.
on King's phone when he opened up Google, and I was like, okay, we both got the same article. And then and then it disappeared from my feed. And then a couple of days later, Stella sent it to me, and I was like, that's kind of funny because I did genuinely want to read it, but I was like, and whenever I had like downtime, I just completely forgot about it because it didn't really I wasn't too bothered by it to like
Yeah.
want to read that. But because she sent it to me, obviously I read it. But yeah, so I
Mm. No,
did.
it's okay. It's okay. I think that's so interesting. And, like understanding that we're kind of, because and I know we were talking before about this, like our brains aren't actually that good at thinking. I read a really interesting book, which I recommend to any teacher, anyone in education, called Why Don't Students Like School? And it was by a psychologist called Daniel T. Willingham. And sorry, let me find it because, yes, so he explains most of the real estate in your brain is dedicated to other functions than thinking, because we've got to remember, in terms of our evolutionary history, we've had access to the internet, and I'm talking about internet from the 60s, nothing like the superhighway tsunami of information that we have now for 0.01% of that time. So this hardware is not equipped to deal with that amount of information. And a lot of the real estate in your brain is dedicated to functions like seeing and moving. Because seeing, in terms of gathering information, it's quick, it's easy, it doesn't take a lot of effort for me to look around and look at my surroundings, and it's quite reliable, to a certain extent. Whereas thinking, it's slow, it's effortful, and it's uncertain. So we can think, obviously, we can think very well under the right circumstances, but this hardware was not built to be able to cope with that amount of information. And, to go back to the ship and shipwreck quote, you've got the ship that's been built, which is unfettered access to each other and to information. I was in Bangkok when the pandemic happened. My parents were in the UK. My brother was in Argentina. The internet allowed us to connect with each other, and that made a huge difference during that time when we were stuck away from each other. And look at the information that's on there that you have access to. Anyone with a phone with internet access, which isn't everybody, it's not everybody yet. But that information is there. But on the other side of it, on the shipwreck side of it, the information isn't necessarily, it's not like back in the day when you'd have had these scientific articles, they've all been peer reviewed. Not a flawless system either. As I said about that experiment, the Stanford experiment, lots of holes in that too. But now we've got, anyone can say anything, and that's great, but that's also terrible. And anyone can engage on anything. So instead of us having this discussion, and be interesting to think what that discussion was like between you and Stella, and how you couldn't have had that conversation commenting beneath a post, which is how I think a lot of people will engage. And like Twitter, people talk about the most spicy, complicated, tremendously important issues on a platform where you're limited to 150 characters. Like it breeds disconnection, it breeds reduction, and it also, I think, knowing that more controversial content gets your engagement, it breeds polarization, which breeds disconnection in people. And there aren't as many, if you're stuck in that cycle, there aren't as many options for you to pause and have a deep dive and think about it from those different perspectives. There's a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt who said the brain is a story processor, not a logic processor. And I think, when we look back at the evolution, to come back onto language, the evolution of language, we told each other stories because it connected us socially to each other, which was vital to our survival. And it allowed us to convey information across generations. Imagine what human progress would look like if we had to start from scratch every generation. We've become so successful as a species because of our ability two work together, strength in numbers, and because of our ability to learn, adapt, pass on that information to each other. And a lot of that would have been done through storytelling. And the brain likes stories because stories are always more simple, more tidy than reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another one of those things that is exploited a bit in some of these online spaces, is that in reality, you know, in these big spicy topics that are polarizing people, you know, and issues that if you're on one side and you're on the other side, we just get backed into our corners. And it's like the study in America with the Republicans and the Democrats. Your brain rewards you for that. So if you've got a belief, and a lot of beliefs are sort of located within the unconscious, it's not that they are fully out in the open and we understand how they were formed, when they were formed, you know, and what influenced that. When we see things that feed into our belief, we reward the chemical process, we reward ourselves for that, and we ignore the information that's counter to that. And I think we've got to just know as a fact any of these topics, and mindfulness is one of them. I'm sure there are people in history who have done mindfulness in a way at a time, and it's had a negative effect for them. It would be ridiculous to say otherwise. But we've also got to acknowledge that things like that, you know, they are always going to be vastly more complex than we'd probably like to think. And on language is amazing. You know, I love language. I'm such a dork for language. I love it. I always have done. I loved grammar, man, in high school. Like, I love that. I love learning different languages and learning grammar. And, you know, so I studied literature at university, but a lot of my passion, you know, what really got me going was the way language was used to convey meaning, to imply different things. And, you know, interpretation is a beautiful thing, the ship, but it also means that we can't ever exactly relay something. So something like an experience, you know, you cannot put down in words what it feels like to have the sun on your face or to eat an orange. Language has its limitations, and even whatever you do put down in words can be interpreted in loads of different ways by different people. And as we've moved into this completely online world, it's words. It's become less about experience, more about language. And I think that balance is off. And I think sometimes the less said about mindfulness, the irony of us doing a podcast and me saying this, sometimes I think the less said, the better, because that balance is off. So I think one of the ways to kind of like address that barrier is to invite people to feel their way through it, like you would navigate a room in the dark. You know, start with the senses. Sitting in silence is intimidating and it's hard. And I try and make myself do it as often as I can, but it is hard. So start with the senses. It's a quote from Alan Watts, which I'll end on because I've gone on, who's a philosopher. And he said, to go out of your mind once a day is tremendously important. By going out of your mind, you come to your senses. And I think that's what we need to shift that balance, to tip those scales into a more homeostasis state. We have to feel our way through it, you know, and I think that's one of the things that puts people off is, oh, just do this, do this. Mindfulness is this. That's a helpful framework, that's a helpful guideline, but it's something you intuit your way through. And I also think it's a great respite from this overthinking, which I think most of us would say we're thinking too much. You know, we're in the middle of a mental health crisis, the flood of information from the online world. And mindfulness is teaching yourself to stop thinking. You know, if those thoughts are cars and you're chasing the cars, it's just letting them pass. And I think we need to be able to feel respite from this constant buzz and surge of that. And I think going into your senses, however you can, whether that's drinking a cup of tea, having a bath, you know, eating your favorite food, it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be a carrot and hummus, you know, eat your birthday cake and enjoy it, but savor it, use those, take advantage of things you already do. And, you know, for the families that I work with, I think they're not going to have time to be able to do this big deep dive and stuff. They need to start somewhere simple. They need to do something easy. It's like that study about flossing one tooth. You know, if you just commit to flossing one tooth one day and you try your best, you keep trying again, that's a better way to develop the habit of flossing all your teeth than saying, I'm going to floss all of my teeth every day, because that's overwhelming for your brain. So take the same way some of these online platforms are taking advantage of neural vulnerabilities and whatever, we can do that too. You know, we can trick ourselves. And I think getting creative about it. So I will actually finish on this, sorry. I think one of the best mindfulness practices that I do is when I'm cooking, I put music on. I have a little kitchen disco, you know. I'm turning the hobs on, chopping the veg, and doing that in that thing that I already have to do. You know, there's a study, dancing is more effective for mental health than medication, as or more effective than medication. If we can get creative about it, we can find a way to come to your senses, give your brain a break because it's exhausting. I think that can be a good in when sitting for a formal practice is you're just not there yet. It will come. Keep trying, but it's a good way in.
Indeed. Indeed. And that's definitely something we really try and promote, you know, is taking these, what we call like mindful moments. Just take a moment, you know, your transition points in your day. You've come home from work, just sit down for a couple minutes. Just sit down, doesn't have to be in like a meditative posture. Just sit down comfy. Don't have your phone. Don't turn the TV on. Just sit and be still for a couple minutes. And just give your body time to adjust, give your mind time to adjust. And maybe just ask yourself, like, how am I doing right now? Where am I at? Is there anything that I could be doing that's going to help improve my situation? And that might be going and grabbing a glass of water. Actually, my body's telling me I'm thirsty. I'm going to go do that rather than just rushing, carry on with my next thing I need to get done. Or it might be actually, you know what, my body's quite tight. It just wants to have a bit of a stretch. Come on, I'm just going to stretch. I don't have to do a big formal yoga lesson. I'm just going to take a few stretches here, put some music on, have a dance. That's what my body wants to do. And, you know, when you explain it that way to people, that there can be so much fun when it comes to just being a bit more mindful, to just really checking in with yourself. I think it takes away quite a lot of those barriers, you know, like quite a lot. I mean, as always, gosh, I'm sure we could continue talking about this for hours and hours, but I do want to be mindful of the time. So tune in. I'm sure there's going to be a part 3, 4, 5, because we're both going to kind of reflect and go, oh, I really wish I'd said that. But thank you as always, Rose. It's been amazing. And I love these conversations. And, I hope those listening, I just hope some of that landed with you. And maybe, this wasn't so much about like, what does your mindfulness practice look like and how does it show up? It was, these are the kind of things that Rose and I talk about, and other members of the Mindful Sparks team, the real big, deep, confusing stuff. And it's being able to navigate those conversations from a more mindful outlook, like being open and being curious to different people's points of view and to different experiences, and to be able to try and show up to these conversations with some compassion as well is really important. So thank you so much for listening. The books, the studies, the reports, the news articles, everything that we made reference to, we'll put in the links below. So do check them out. And yeah, I'm going to wrap it up here. So again, thank you so much, Rose.
Thank you for having me. It was really wonderful. Thank you for making such a lovely space for us to have these big conversations. I'll see you again.
And everyone else, be sure to check out our other podcasts that we have. We've got loads of different people from different walks of life, having some big, maybe some more practical conversations as well, just about what mindfulness looks like in their lives.